Food. It's something we all need and most of us love, but in anime it's more often than not just an afterthought. Sure, there are some shows that highlight the importance and the role a good meal shared can serve as a part of a story. In Golden Kamuy, food is the great unifier and a way to explore different cultures. In Ghibli films, it's art, and in Food Wars. Anyway, food is one of those things that you barely ever stop and go, wait a minute, these guys are barely ever eating during their adventures. Sitting down to make dinner is used more as a pacing tool. It's for those quiet scenes in between the action. But what if that pacing tool was the primary element of a show? Well, you'd get Delicious in Dungeon. The new dungeon-crawling, monster-eating, light-hearted-ish adventure anime focused around the importance of eating a balanced diet. Of course, it being a gourmet show, you'd expect some good food, but what I didn't expect was the realism of it, and I use that word in quotation marks, but at the same time not. Since among the dragons, giant frogs and magic, there is an element of believability that I can only call realistic. However, before we get further into that, a quick word from the channel partner. I have once again partnered up with Vittujenkevat. They are a Finnish jewelry and household item brand specializing in high-quality handcrafted and cruelty-free items with the humorous theme of genitalia. Products ranging from gold and silver necklaces and earrings to cookie cutters, mugs and bedsheets. Head over there now and get 10% of your entire purchase at vittujenkevat.fi by using the link in the description and pinned comment, or by using the code AddedCheese at checkout. And now, back to Delicious in Dungeon. It's the show you get when you decide to tell children, and sometimes adults, that you should always taste everything in an effort to get them to embrace better eating habits. But unlike the boring Western teaching videos we always had in school, Delicious in Dungeon... Right, okay. I absolutely detest that English name, so we're gonna go with Dungeon Meshi from now on. So, Dungeon Meshi is a wild and vaguely educational gourmet adventure anime heading into the depths of a magical dungeon. And of course, it all starts with hunger. Quite literally, Laios and gang failed to take down a red dragon since they didn't have the resources for a proper dinner beforehand, and hunger brings low even the mightiest of warriors. Not that Laios would be the typical can-do-anything hero, but you know, he and especially his party is no slouch, and a dragon shouldn't have been much of a problem, but they didn't eat their greens, so death was the result. Well, not exactly death, but getting teleported out by Laios' sister, who was unfortunately left behind, having been eaten by the dragon they were fighting, since, you know, monsters also need to eat. And what do you do when your sister gets eaten by a dragon? Well, you obviously head back down there in an effort to save her. Although, she was eaten by a dragon. So, how do you go about saving someone who is presumed dead? And the answer is very, very simple. Magic. Well, not that simple really. It's actually a combination of some unexpectedly clever world building and the aforementioned feel of realism, which honestly is a part of the world building, but you know, I wanted to include it anyway. Sure, it's a world of magic and thus resurrection magic exists, but not everywhere. The dungeon is an unnatural magical environment where one's soul is tied to their body, even after death, and so they can be resurrected, and thus death is a natural part of this world, and it's brought up a lot. Every single adventurer has died, often more than once, and there are even adventure parties whose special job in the dungeon is to go around resurrecting people or bringing their bodies back near the entrance for it and charging money for doing so. Okay, sure, you can resurrect people, that's cool, but Falin got eaten. Surely you need an intact body and not just a pile of poo for that to work. And that is where the realism part comes in. Dragons are, generally speaking, considered reptiles, and reptilians, especially big ones, tend to digest their food slowly, and so we have a ticking timer creating that all-important feeling of pressure, without it being too overbearing. Yes, it does sometimes end up feeling like there isn't that much pressure pushing Laios and the gang forward, but then you remember that death is an everyday occurrence here, so naturally it wouldn't be in the forefront of their minds. Of course, digesting someone isn't really a time thing, like one moment they're there and a week later they just get completely liquefied in an instant, but I still like it as reasoning. It's fitting. But Big Lizard's digestion functionality and the prevalence of dead adventurers are not the only signs of the honestly amazing world building in Dungeon Meshi. Sure, the outside world doesn't have a lot going on, but the dungeon itself and everything living in it has more detail put in it that is frankly necessary, which means that this underground ecosystem feels far more alive than your average fantasy world. The dungeon genuinely feels alive. Sure, there are the very direct mentions by Senshi, the monster food connoisseur, about the balance of the ecosystem here, but as on the nose as they are, it's also something that's important in real ecosystems here on Earth. You disrupt the balance in one spot and the ripples will affect everything else down the line. And it's the same in the dungeon, but the beasties calling the place home are not the only things down here, and the party has to deal with things that shouldn't necessarily be there and are thus disrupting the usual flow of the adventure, like giant man-eating squid killing all the tasty medium-sized creatures. But there is other life in the dungeon as well. Mainly people. Yes, the monsters too, but I want to talk about them in a little more detail soon, so for now it's just the boring-ass people. Your average dungeon crawling anime tends to be of the MMORPG instance style of dungeons. It's you, maybe some friends, and a bunch of monsters. But here the people genuinely use the dungeon. I already mentioned the groups profiting from rescuing corpses, but they aren't the only ones. Not only are there other parties that Laios and the others run into on occasion, but there are settlements and even pubs scattered throughout the dungeon. Of course, the further you go, the less there are, but it feels like something people would actually do. It's like the people in this world are the British in the 16th century. They've established a colony in this foreign land, stripped it of its riches, and are now making outposts to push even further, all the while disrupting the natural order and generally making things far shittier for the original inhabitants. You know, for king and country. Okay, not quite, since in the dungeon the ultimate goal is to become the king, not to serve one, but you get the picture. But I did promise a word about the monsters, and that I shall provide. And yes, this is probably my worst transition ever, I know. Anyway, monsters. Any self-respecting dungeon-crawling adventure needs them, and Dungeon Meshi doubly so, since the entire point is to eat the damn things. Good thing then that the monster design is amazing. It's so far not the most inventive as such, since you do have a lot of the usual suspects, from dragons and cockatrices to mimics and living armor. Yes, there are a few unique ones too, like the treasure bugs, but as a whole it's very box-standard fantasy and mythology stuff. The interesting part comes from the design, since the simple action of turning something from a creepy crawly to a mouth-watering piece of animated food, generally speaking, requires a little more nuance than just stab it and move on. And so, Dungeon Meshi goes out of its way to delve into each creature in frankly more depth than might have been strictly necessary, from the parasites of parasites to coming up with inventive ways to turn living suits of armor into something edible by adding in that gooey fleshy bit in there as well. And it's not just limited to how one might saute a man-eating tomato plant or what color poo you can find inside a giant scorpion. The monster design extends to the environment and the purpose of the beasts too. The red dragon lives underground, so it has no wings because it has no use for them, and the mer people have two forms, from the charming hunters of unwary adventurers to the more fish-like generalists responsible for the tribe's daily activities. But by far my favorite monster design has to be the mimic. There is just something so fitting about a killer hermit crab as the mimic. I generally like the idea of mimics, and this one has to be my favorite ever. Sorry Dark Souls, but those lanky bastards have killed me far too many times for it to be funny anymore. And it's not just the monsters that get the good treatment, since the characters too are a charming bunch with a lot of thought behind them, and while there ends up being a surprising number of them, I never found myself forgetting who is who and how they join in the story. Of course, the main gang of Laios, Chilchak, Marshall and Senshi are the most well thought out, being the main cast and all, but so far everyone we've met in the anime has a nice bit of story behind them. And they all work very well both together and in their environment in a way that makes the already vibrant world feel even more well-rounded. Sure, they aren't perfect, and things like Laios' insistence on tasting anything that crawls, flies or squats in the mud can be a little off-putting, Especially given that the entire point of him doing it now is to not waste the time it would take to raise money for supplies in order to save his sister in time. But at least the other characters, mainly Marcel, also recognize this, leading to some humorous moments. Moments which can be a little on the dry side, like a lot of the jokes in Dungeon Meshi, but you don't really need to be laughing at every quip to enjoy the show, since at the end of the day, it's about the food. And the food is, well, very well done, much like so much else in the show. It's mostly very Japanese food, covering everything from the preparation of the ingredients to the actual cooking bits, and of course the most important part, the eating. But it's not there just to make you hungrier than it has any right to when what they're eating is a giant parasite. The cooking scenes in Dungeon Meshi have a very big emphasis on promoting the importance of not only balanced diet, but also trying new things. After all, in my experience, and I'd suspect the authors too, it's often the things that you least expect to be tasty that end up being the best stuff. With the possible exception of British food, but I think that is well known by everyone at this point. And in all honesty, the food scenes are pretty damn good, and they look even better. Something that applies to everything in the show. Dungeon Meshi looks great, although a stylized kind of great. And yes, I know how tired it sounds to say that the show looks good, and it's not like anyone who has ever seen anything by Studio Trigger would be even mildly surprised by the quality of the animation, but I still found the style of Dungeon Meshi to be weirdly charming, and thus felt that it needed a mention. That and looks are very often crucial for a show about food, since you want to convey the deliciousness to an audience that can never taste it, and sure, describing the flavor is a good place to start, but a picture is worth 1,000 words is a saying for a reason. All in all, Dungeon Meshi is kind of like a less dark Golden Kamuy, both noting the importance of food as the great unifier and as the key element of their world building. Admittedly, the world in Dungeon Meshi requiring a lot more of that building given its fantastical nature, but at least for my money those requirements were more than sufficiently met. The show is both educational and enjoyable while disguising the important topics into what I can only describe as a fun adventure. 8 out of 10 Cheese recommends, and yes, I'll admit that a relatively high score was a given the moment I compared it to Golden Kamuy, even if there is a regrettable lack of dick jokes in Dungeon Meshi. With that, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, do all of the YouTubey things, likes, comments, subscribe, at this point. Any form of interaction is hugely appreciated, as the channel has been kind of in the hole as of late, and my algorithm-based overlords really appreciate those interactions. But on a more positive note, the channel has now finally reached the 4,000 public viewing hours required for monetization, and a huge thank you for that goes to, well, you people. What this does mean now is that in the near future there will be some ads on the videos. Sorry about that. But here's hoping that it all explodes and I can finally turn this from a hobby into something a little bit more financially viable. On that note, you can also go and check out the channel partner over at vittujenkevat.fi, and maybe you'll find something that catches your fancy. Anyway, with this, I've been Cheese, and up to next time, ta-ta for now.